Television media in the UK has been criticised for what has been seen as inadequate coverage of the Kashmir earthquake compared to the coverage given to Hurricane Katrina. Some critics have accused the television media of inherent bias against the developing world. Sonali Advani finds out whether there was an intentional bias in the way the two catastrophes were covered by the television media in the UK. She also looks at the question of television media's intrusion onto the privacy of the grieving survivors and if the victims of the two disasters were treated differently.
In some towns and villages, a whole generation of children is lost.
The strongest earthquake here in 100 years, and more pain.
Over 70,000 dead, a similar number injured, and over 3 million homeless.
This is a city in shock.
Hurricane Katrina is now ploughing its way north onto the US mainland with terrific force and winds of up to 150 miles an hour.
On September of 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the United States, killing about 1,800 people. Just a month later, a powerful earthquake of magnitude 7.6 on the Richter scale struck Kashmir region of Pakistan and India, killing more than 80,000, making it the worst and most destructive earthquake in 2 decades. Television media in the UK was criticised for what was seen as inadequate coverage of the Kashmir earthquake, especially in comparison to the coverage given to Hurricane Katrina. Intrigued by the controversy surrounding the coverage of the two disasters, I reviewed the 10 o'clock news on BBC and 10:30 PM news on ITV for a fortnight following the disasters. The criticism that television media had spent much less time on Kashmir earthquake was confirmed. The story on Hurricane Katrina was covered for more number of days on both the channels. On the BBC, Kashmir earthquake received a third of the time given to Hurricane Katrina over a fortnight. And on ITV, Kashmir earthquake received only half the time given to Hurricane Katrina over a fortnight. This despite the fact that Kashmir earthquake was the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in South Asia, and it left more than 3 million homeless. So why was there a difference in the extent of coverage of the two disasters? Did the earthquake receive less coverage because of some kind of institutional racism or ethnic bias, as some critics claim? Or is it something to do with the way events are evaluated editorially? I set out to find the reasons for the difference in the extent of coverage of the two disasters and interviewed leading members of the media. Phil Turner, journalist with Rotherham Advertiser, believes media's bias against regions like South Asia was the overriding cause.
It's quite clear that the earthquake in Kashmir very, very quickly disappeared from the headlines, and the real story was never told. An absolute tragedy for everyone, which was being ignored by the media, but also by the world's governments, the world's leaders. I think the agenda was somewhat racist because people in that part of the world are just regarded as not being as important as either in New Orleans or if you compare it to the tsunami in South Asia, where there was quite a big Western involvement.
Beena Sarwar, a journalist from Pakistan, echoes the views of Phil Turner. She agrees that the fact that few Westerners were affected by the quake meant lack of identification by the media and the audience in the UK for the victims of the quake.
Also, there's, I think, a lack of sympathy for that particular area because it is known for its support of religious extremists along the lines of what is called the Taliban. And I think there was also a lack of identification with the population of those mountain villages and areas. There were no Westerners involved or affected at all. And so you didn't have any stories from people like us, quote unquote, who would be able to, convey a sense of what had happened.
So did the viewers of BBC and ITV in the UK identify less with the victims of the Kashmir earthquake? Did they prefer to see more coverage on Hurricane Katrina? Most media persons say that television media, like any other business, needs to cater to its viewers to remain commercially viable. But is news selection influenced only by audience preferences? Phil Turner challenges this view.
I think mostly there is an assumption about what viewers and readers might want to know about. But really, it's driven by the people at the top whose ideas about the world are very top-down, and therefore, politically, they're not challenged. The media's owned and controlled by the billionaires with huge government influence. Therefore, they don't really want to tell the story of ordinary people's lives, and certainly here, some of the very poorest who'd lost what little they had, they're not seen by the media as being interesting and important.
In fact, a strong immigrant population from the Kashmir region in the UK would have made this disaster more interesting to the audience in UK. Adam Brooks, BBC's Pentagon correspondent.
Clearly, in the case of the Pakistan earthquake, Britain's large South Asian community was going to be an important factor. People were going to be directly affected in very personal ways by what happened in Pakistan. And much of the story seemed to be about the response inside the UK. So yes, I'm quite sure that the presence in Britain of a large South Asian community would have entered into editorial decision-making.
Yet, the quake received less time compared to Hurricane Katrina. Adam Brooks covered Hurricane Katrina. He offers one of the reasons for this difference in the extent of the coverage. News broadcasters, he says, are constrained by lack of resources when deciding how much coverage they can provide to a natural disaster in a country like Pakistan.
The first thing that one has to look at in these situations is the resources of news organizations. All news organizations, when they deploy journalists and they deploy equipment, particularly in a very expensive medium like television, you are constrained automatically to some degree by money. Every organization has a finite budget. When you deploy to a country like Pakistan to cover a natural disaster, your resources are immediately stretched. It's a colossally expensive business. Flying in journalists, producers, satellite dishes, satellite telephones, cameras, edit packs, safety equipment, tents, food, water, you name it. It is a huge logistical challenge, and it's very, very expensive. Your cost per minute of broadcast immediately escalates hugely. Small news organizations will be totally unable to provide any coverage of Pakistan earthquake because they just don't have the resources. That doesn't mean that they don't care about the Pakistan earthquake. It just means they can't afford to do it.
And it's not just a question of resources. During a disaster, journalists face logistical challenges too. Kashmir earthquake hit the mountainous regions, causing many landslides. This made an already remote region even more difficult to access. Journalists covering the Kashmir earthquake had to rely on irregular helicopter flights and had to compete for limited seats. Nick Bryant, BBC's South Asia correspondent, covered the quake in Pakistan.
In South Asia quake, we have real problems with deadlines because often we'd set off thinking we had enough time to drive back to the place where we were feeding our material from by satellite, only to find that the roads had been blocked by a fresh landfall. So we had manifold difficulties in covering the South Asia quake. Very few of the places that we could have stayed could put us up because they weren't safe. So there are all sorts of logistical problems.
But there was another factor too that may have influenced the extent of coverage given to the Kashmir earthquake. 2005 will probably be remembered as a year of natural disasters. The Kashmir earthquake came hot on the heels of the Asian tsunami and Hurricane Katrina. This may have resulted in what is called disaster fatigue. Nick Bryant explains.
There may well have been disaster fatigue in South Asia. We'd had the tsunami, it had affected Sri Lanka, it had affected Indonesia in a massive way, obviously, and it also affected India. To have an earthquake on the scale of the South Asian quake, just 10 months later, I think there may have been a level of disaster fatigue, which certainly wasn't the case in Katrina. Katrina was a very fresh story. Obviously, there have been hurricanes in the past, but none which paralysed a major city in the same way that Katrina did.
There could have been another factor at work. Hurricane Katrina was not only one of the deadliest hurricanes in the US, it also had a potentially greater worldwide political significance than Kashmir earthquake. Adam Brooks, BBC's Pentagon correspondent, explains.
You name any big Asian natural disaster, they are of colossal, painful impact on the people, on the victims. They do not, however, frequently have lasting political effects. That's just the reality of what they are. Hurricane Katrina, on the other hand, was the turning point in the presidency of George W. Bush. This was not only a story about the impact of a natural disaster on very vulnerable people. It was a huge political moment. And it was a moment that affects George W. Bush, the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, the man who makes decisions that are felt by every corner of the planet. So editorially, the Katrina case is to be treated somewhat differently to natural disasters that don't have that very, very significant political impact that Katrina had. A disaster in the heart of the United States resonates through the political, social, or economic institutions that define the world in which we live. There are simply more consequences. The ripples spread out further. They're bigger. And that may seem like a very harsh, rather callous judgment, but it isn't. It's simply it's just a realistic one, I'm afraid, in editorial terms.
The wrath of Hurricane Katrina, hundreds are feared dead. And of course there's a question for President Bush. The question is, can he recover from this?
Thousands of people feared dead as a huge earthquake hits Pakistan and India.
There's also a separate question of whether the television media in the UK treated the victims of the two disasters with equal dignity. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, more survivors were interviewed. For the quake in Kashmir, there were more stark pictures of distressed women and children. Did the television media in the UK exploit the grief of only the survivors of the quake? Nick Bryant explains the reasons for this difference in the coverage of the two disasters.
I think there's a basic language reason why there was that difference in coverage. Black Americans living in the Deep South have this extraordinary capability to articulate what they're feeling in very colourful language, and I think that makes extraordinary television and radio when they speak on air about their experiences. Now, clearly, in South Asia, very few victims of the South Asian quake spoke English. We'd often use interpreters, we'd often voice over what they were saying. But often, what was just as poignant in that situation was to look at a picture of them, because it spoke for itself. It spoke very eloquently of their suffering.
Journalists say showing the sufferings of victims of a disaster is necessary. Charities like Save the Children say this should be done in a sensitive manner. But that does not always happen. Laura Conrad, head of news at Save the Children, worked with the victims of the Asian tsunami.
What I have seen is when children are being interviewed, quite often we'll start telling their story, and when the journalist realises it's not quite as juicy as they want, then the journalist quickly cuts the child down and moves on in search of somebody with a more tragic story. The other thing I've seen is when a journalist asks a child to relay something quite sensitive and quite traumatic, and then wants them to do it again for the purposes of a better recording. Both of those I felt have been inappropriate.
Nick Bryant argues that disasters such as the tsunami or the Kashmir earthquake are so huge that the media does not deliberately need to interview the victims over and over again. He says journalists are sensitive towards the grief of the survivors. Also, at times, the victims may welcome a chance to speak to the media.
In the tsunami and in the South Asian quake, there were so many victims with so very many awful stories. It wasn't as if somebody had a better story than the other person, so we chased to find that person. I mean, everybody had a terrible story to tell. So we didn't find that the need to get people to sort of repeat their stories over and over. I think what we do is if we see any sort of negative reaction to us being there, any sort of feeling that we're unwelcome, we'll turn off the camera straight away and go. I'm always amazed how helpful many people seem to find television cameras in terms of acting as a kind of cathartic release.
These views are echoed by Dr. Syed Mahmood Ali Shah of Johns Hopkins University in the US, who coordinated relief operations during the quake in Kashmir. Dr. Shah lost some of his friends in the quake. He believes that showing the suffering of the victims of a disaster may be necessary to launch an effective and humane response to a disaster. He says the television media was welcomed in Abbottabad, a town that was affected by the quake.
They were very welcome when they came. The journalists came as far as in the local hospital, and actually the hospital wanted in some cases to have that coverage so that the people could know that there was something going on over here, so that people could actively contribute towards the cause. In my opinion, I think people don't get moved until they see grief. The picture, the visuals move us more. So I think it's very important that the media is able to portray the tragedy in a way which moves people.
Telling these moving stories of human tragedy is necessary, but journalists should deal with the victim of a disaster in a compassionate manner, says Mark Brain of Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma.
Journalists have to intrude, because if they didn't intrude, they wouldn't be able to tell the story. But what's absolutely essential is that when journalists do intrude and go up to a survivor or a victim of an experience of trauma or terrorism or disaster or earthquake, is that they know what they're doing and that they can ask the questions with respect, they can do it with compassion, and they don't unnecessarily re-traumatize or make things worse for the people they're talking to. There is an important story to be told, and journalists need to tell the story, and people who've been through bad experiences, on the whole, will understand that and help.
Adam Brooks agrees.
It would be very, very difficult to tell the story of a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina without illustrating its human impact. It can be extremely awkward, a very, very difficult thing to do. I've done it enough times, finding people who have been through exceptionally traumatic moments, getting them to tell their story and then leaving them behind. It can be excruciatingly awkward, and one becomes somewhat resigned to that feeling. As a foreign correspondent, you just do it and get on with it. It is necessary to portray natural disasters, any kind of disaster, in terms of their human impact. If we don't, then disasters simply become a stream of figures and statistics. You lose the human face. You lose the reality of what it means to be in an earthquake in Pakistan.
Coming back to the question I asked in the beginning, did the television media in the UK, particularly the BBC and ITV, attribute unequal significance to Hurricane Katrina and Kashmir earthquake? On the surface, yes, the two broadcasters committed more airtime to Hurricane Katrina than the quake that left more than 3 million homeless. One of the journalists I interviewed said Hurricane Katrina received more coverage because it had a shock value. Here was a major city in a rich and powerful nation completely stranded. Then again, nearly 30,000 children were killed in the quake when the schools around them collapsed. Was this of any less shock? So why was there a difference in the amount of coverage the two disasters received? Practical reasons, such as logistical challenges, lack of financial or human resources, influenced the extent of coverage, especially in a medium like television. The putative interest of a media organization's audience is yet another important factor. Adam Brooks is adamant that television media's editorial decisions are not based on some kind of a deliberate racial bias.
Why does an air crash in the Philippines get a 20-second right and a few floated pictures, whereas an air crash in the United States will get all-day blanket coverage worldwide? Why do flash floods in China or South Asia merit a few moments of television time, whereas Hurricane Katrina is the biggest story of the year? Why does that happen? And I would just suggest that there isn't a conspiracy here. There isn't a conscious set of decision-making in editorial meetings where editors sit around and say, it's the Philippines or it's Pakistan, we don't care. You know, they're brown people, they're not of interest to our audience, we're not going to film that. That's not what happened. And it's very tempting to ascribe racism to it. I think that there are many other influences at work, and some of them are much more simplistic than you might imagine.
Justified or not, the political and economic subtext of a disaster determines the level of commitment given by any media to a disaster story. There seems to be little connection between the scale of the disaster and the extent of media coverage. So when 80,000 lives lost in a quake are weighed against George W. Bush's presidency being at stake, it raises a debate and discussion on what constitutes news values.